This is James Rosebush.
This is Robert Hunter, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
I love it. I love these things. I've had James and Robert on the show before, and then I was talking with James when the first time I had him on, and I'm like, I'd love to have you come on with this friend of mine. He's a former ambassador to NATO, and we're going on with this guy kind of giving Robert's resume, and he's like, I know him. He's my neighbor across the street. And he's crazy.
In the small world category, right?
Totally. Yeah. But I'd really love to get you. We're in such a weird time, where we have this, and I'm going to say this in the way, like in the least challenging way. We have an election that has made a lot of people unsure of the legitimacy of the election, whether you're for Biden or Trump. I don't care about that. But there's a lot of people that are like, hey, what's going on? And now we've got news that the DNI is reporting that there is external influence in our election. We clearly have a media bias problem. We have a lot of things that are undermining our ability to have a democracy, fellas. What in general are your thoughts? And again, we're not trying to put anybody on a position, but what in general are your thoughts? Would you go first, James?
I think it's interesting when you said people are waking up to realize that there's foreign influence on our elections, because it's, the U.S. has influence on other countries' elections. So this isn't something new, and it isn't anything surprising. It's a tactic. It's using the tools that are at hand. We're already in cyber warfare on many different levels. So why wouldn't they seek to influence an election? Americans seek to influence the election. So why wouldn't other countries seek to influence, or at least weight it in their behalf? So it's certainly no surprise to me. I don't think that any American should wake up in the morning and be surprised by something like that.
Robert?
Well, unfortunately, we're in agreement already. I just don't think that what foreigners do in our elections changes anything. We had the loser got the largest number of votes in history for anybody who ran for president, except for the guy who won, who got 7 million votes more. And the idea that the Russians or the Chinese or the Martians or anybody could have made a big difference, I think it's ludicrous. I didn't think it made a difference in 2016, quite frankly. Sure, the Russians were hacking, but I can't believe in the 3 states that supposedly made the difference because they went away. People didn't think it was going to go. I don't think people there were paying attention to what the Russians did. Now, in terms of legitimacy, if I can jump to that for a second,
Please.
I've been seeing a lot of elections. Was John Kennedy legitimately elected in 1960 with Mayor Daley? The year 2000, which was decided by a single vote, 5-4 in the Supreme Court. 1968, where the Republicans got the Vietnamese to screw things up with the talks. This time, when somebody's elected president and gets the electoral votes and sworn in, that person is president of the United States. Okay, fellas, forget about how it got there. Let's work together and make the country work. So I'm not worried about that.
I do think it is important, though, to pursue if there are any systems that have been compromised for future elections. I think that we need to, even though the federal government can't really control the way states manage the elections, and I think for good reason, I do think pursuing and investigating whether there have been any improprieties or anything that has really gone on that hasn't been highly ethical. I think that's important. So I think having hearings, I think deposing people who have been in charge of running the machinery, the technology and that sort of thing. I think for discovery, if for nothing else, I think it's important to have these investigations so that in the future, we'll have either a marker or a standard by which we judge the authenticity of these elections, but we'll be more knowledgeable about it. And I think I'm a big believer in total transparency. So I want everyone to know what went on in every state to the degree that we can find out and to have it exposed, because I think that's the safest way to protect the integrity of the electoral process.
Hey, Pete, why did you have the two of us on if we're going to agree on everything? We must be disagreeing. I do worry about hacking and all of that, but elections happen, every 2 years or something like that, and we got to do something about it. I'm more worried about the cyber hacking in our daily lives, but I think James does have a fundamental point here, which is we have to have people in this country believing that the democratic processes are working, of which elections are one of the most important things that we have to do it. And we fought about this our entire history to make sure people have confidence that the institutions that represent them, us, are things that are going to enable us to work together to solve the nation's problems. And if you have questioning, legitimate questioning, then you got to do something about it. And let's turn over every stone and get to the bottom of every well and whatever other cliche I can come up with.
I always do a little test in my mind. So in terms of partisanship and things like hearings that are going on right now about the election, so I say to myself, well, if the outcome had been different, the other party, would they have been pursuing these investigations? Oh, you better believe it. If the Democrats believed that building a wall on the Mexican border would have allowed in more Republicans, they would have been in there putting the first shovel in the ground. So I always do this little test in my mind. Would this be happening if the whole thing had been reversed? Yes. So it's a part of and this is the way I think about this constant parade of, our country's divided, our country's divided. Well, it's a good thing that we are divided. We have a two-party at this point. We have a two-party system. We have the ability to, when one party is in power, particularly in the White House, the other party only has one thing to do, and that is to get him out. And that's the way it works. And I think that is something that preserves our constitutional republic. So I'm not as overwrought about division. I believe the big problem, and I think Robert hinted to this, that the real problem is the festering and the fostering of division in social media. And that is really, really, I think, the culprit behind a tremendous amount of what people call division and divisiveness and disunity. I think we are unified as Americans. Even the most strident and angry opponent of our form of government lives here and enjoys our freedoms. So I think that the focus for attacking or solving the division problem really has its roots in social media.
Well, I agree on what the opposite parties do. For example, I'm a Democrat, okay? I didn't like what happened in 2016, but I also said to my colleagues, get over it. Mr. Trump won, but people were trying to impeach him before he even got inaugurated. And I worried about crying wolf. I said, there are enough problems with this guy. But if you're going to go after every single little thing, then if something important comes along, people are not going to pay attention. I think a lot of that happened. Are we divided as a nation? I hope so. I hope we have different views. That's why we have politics. Politics is fundamentally about how you broker differences of interest so we can get anything done. That's what politics is all about. And we have been fortunate as a nation, except for one huge thing in 1860, that we've been able to make it work. Now, your second point, social media. I'm not going to allow the mainstream media off the hook, because a lot of social media is people ranting, finding that they can get a platform out there, but how much does that get broadcast to the wider world? It's people doing clicks so they can watch somebody's social media, but part of it is the mainstream media picking this stuff and amplifying it. And I think they've gotten, with major exceptions, a rotten job of enabling us to have the kind of civilized debate that we have to have in order to make things work.
I think that I agree, Robert. I think that when the founders created a free media, they didn't imagine that media would become a massive industry, that I say people get excited and can you believe that they're saying this kind of stuff? Well, yeah, I get it. I totally get it. I get it.
They're trying to send stuff back early. This is not the first time there's been mudslinging and name calling.
Totally. And we have to have more history to you go back to the early 20th century. There's tremendous amount of yellow journalism, all that sort of thing. But I think we do have to have integrity in information. And I had an interesting experience happen to me yesterday. I was retained a very brief engagement by Google, and they wanted my opinion about they were working on some kind of product that they were going to roll out. And I said, well, I'll give you my feedback on that, but I'll also tell you that from my point of view, my trust of the information I get on Google today, and and anyone else, I'm Googling probably 50 times, 100 times a day if I'm looking for information. Is that information have the integrity that I'm looking for? Or is it telling me what Google wants me to know? Well, you could say that about Webster's unabridged dictionary too. I mean, Webster, someone is telling you what a word means. But I think that people need to have information that has integrity behind it and not the opinion of big media. So big media is what they have to do. They have one job to do as well. And Robert and I have been involved in media for years and years and years. So big media has a job to do. What is that job? Sell advertising.
Yes.
That is and that's what pays their
business.
That's what pays their big salaries. And these guys go on and they make a whole lot more than we make sitting in our neighborhood here doing what we do, because they're paid to be sensational. And they're paid, always today. What is it today? You see breaking news. I get all this stuff from the New York Times and the Wall Street, breaking news. When I break it down, it isn't breaking news, but they think, and I wonder when that term is going to wear out, breaking news. Because you can only say that so many times and people are going to go, this is not breaking news. You did not have to interrupt my dinner, or you didn't have to interrupt my speech, or whatever it is. But this is where they're trying to get you. Why are they doing this? Because they need to sell advertising. When you go, and if you've ever been at like a presidential press conference, for example, we used to have these massive press conferences in the East Room of the White House, right? So if you remember, we had, Robert knew her as well. So we had this fantastic woman who was called the Dean of the White House Press Corps. And she always opened it and then she would close it. Thank you, Mr. President. Well, this is like a pack of dogs.
Helen Thomas was a friend of mine.
Helen Thomas was a very, very close friend of mine because we were both from Detroit. And so you see that.
Well, no, but nobody's perfect.
Yeah. So you see, I know. It's a mark on my back, but you see that these people were like a pack of mad dogs. Why? They only had one reason to ask a question. It wasn't necessarily a bona fide question. It could be a trick question. And this is for all presidents, Democrats and Republicans. And they want to get their face on the evening news. And when I was in the White House, what we were basically playing to was the network news. So that is what we wanted to control. And Reagan had this brilliant idea of this team that I had the honor of serving on, which is called the Theme for the Day. And what we tried to do was to basically focus everything the president was doing that day. But then what we did, we measured whether we were successful or not by seeing how they interpreted on the evening news. Now today, that's laughable because you have 24/7 Twitter putting out exactly what they want. But anyway, it's interesting.
Well, it did change. When I worked in the Johnson White House, I'm even older, and one of the things I did for my boss, Doug Cater, who used to brief the president before press conferences, I just read the Washington Post, New York Times, and I get front pages, and I say, these are the things that you're going to get asked about, because most journalists are doing exactly what you do, and we write the Q&A based on those things, and we used to get about 90% of them right. Now, Johnson had a technique when he got in trouble. There was a wonderful woman from Texas named Sarah McClendon.
Oh my gosh.
She was a
Sarah McClendon. She was a piece of work.
When he'd get in trouble, he'd say, Sarah, you got a question. She said, Mr. President, down in the transportation department, they got a civil servant there who's causing all kinds of problems for people who want to drive on the left-hand side, or whatever it is. He'd say, well, thank you. And everybody'd laugh. And that would break the tension. Then Johnson would switch the subject and get off the bad stuff. Now, as you say, 24/7. It used to be that there was a news cycle. It used to be the White House could say, we have a lid on it. We didn't get any more news today. That's it. And so they'd have to go with it. Now, of course, 24/7, they got to sell all this ad time. Everybody wants to get their face on. My little joke last year is we were going through all this stuff the last 4 years with Trump. The guy, I wanted to get out of there, but I watched him manipulate it. I say, why don't we get the folks up in the trustees of Columbia University to put out 2,000 Pulitzer Prizes? Give everybody a Pulitzer Prize, and they'd all have one, and then they could start doing a proper job.
Well, that news cycle reminded me that Nancy Reagan's law, it's called Nancy Reagan's law, always put out bad news on Friday night and good news on Monday morning. So that because
Come on,
there was no news on the weekend. So you know, if you got something bad to say, you put it out on Friday night. Monday morning, it's going to run for the whole week. But Sarah McClendon, McClatchy News Service, what a character she was. But I thought you were going to say that when Johnson really wanted to command the journalists, he invited them up to his bathroom to have a one-on-one from his bathtub.
Well, I'm not going to go on that one, but I know what you're talking about. And some of he had a lot of press conferences, small group in either in the Oval Office or in the cabinet room without media, without sound and video, that kind of thing. And he would say incredibly outrageous things. We are now live. It used to be that if there were taped interviews and a politician got in trouble, what he or she would do with it, come out with some vile curse words, and that would kill the interview. Now, of course, if it happens, they just run with the president just said, give me a break. Yeah. But you're right, it is a game, and it's a valuable one because the president has to be able to respond to things and respond to things intelligently. I
want to tee something up here with you guys.
But then you got to have a way for people to make judgments. Let me go back to that central point. I read more than one newspaper. I'm constantly on the internet looking for things. If I see something I don't believe in, I then switch to what is the BBC saying? What is Le Monde saying? What are my friends saying? And this kind of thing. But then I worry about what about the average person out there who's not in our business, like James and I are. How do they figure out what's real and what's not real? That's what's really troubling me. We don't have a Walter Cronkite anymore. We don't have Edward R. Murrow, who were very careful not to do stupid things or self-serving things. And people trusted them. Now, I can't think of a single person in the electronic media whom I would trust, who has broad trust across the country. We'll put you on, James. You can be the guy I'm prepared to trust. Sometime.
I'm with you. I'm with you. I'm looking for someone that's why I think the same as you, Robert. I have to read broadly and listen to different sources and even then I'm not sure I'm getting the truth. I really don't. I'm just the kind of person that I have to find out for myself. And sometimes you can't find out. In particularly things that have to do with intelligence. I think that's very, very difficult to parse that in the right way. And I'm skeptical about anything that I hear or anything that I learn, especially because I do not want, to the extent that I can, to allow myself to be controlled by another person's thinking. I don't want someone to control what my view is. I'm trying to unpack it and I'm trying to get to the truth. But there is that centuries old question: what is truth? And I think people would like to have trusted sources and know. But even though at the pinnacle of power in the whole world is the president of the United States, and you don't always get truth out of the president of the United States either, or it can be parsed in a way that it's sort of a truth, but it isn't. And this is not good. People always say, well, when they talk about ratings for a president, for example, during a presidency, they'll say, but the Congress has had historically low levels of public confidence for decades. And the same thing for the news media, but they don't care. The news media and the U.S. Congress are about 10% of public support.
And where you find the 10%, I don't know, but that's another matter.
But that is not good. I always say that. There'll be people that will say, oh, ha, they'll laugh at that. We need to have confidence in our public institutions. We need to have that confidence, and we need to have these positions filled by people of integrity. And this is something that we have to promote more, rather than saying, well, they're just politicians. It's sort of ha. They've come into this through corrupt means. This is not good for our country.
I haven't seen any polling lately, but it used to be said the average American does not trust the Congress except for their own member of Congress,
right?
Who they may know something about. But you put your finger on something. You need people to be skeptical, to think for themselves. Whenever I finish a lecture, I say, now you got to go out and think for yourself, because otherwise somebody's going to try to sell you something, including me. You want to agree with me? That's wonderful. I'll take your vote away from you. Fine, I'd be happy to run everything. But how do you then, on the other side, get people to have enough trust in the public servants that we have and the process, so they don't just turn off and allow the few who are able to manipulate things to be in charge? That's the balance we're going to strike, and I think it has been struck the wrong way for a couple of decades now.
One of the things I want to ask you guys about this, because of your experience.
Oh, did you want to say something, Pete?
Yeah, I'm trying. No, but I love you guys.
What is that hat you got on?
You're talking to the Washington talkers here.
Yeah.
We're just Washington's loaded with people like us.
Yeah,
I'm gonna get my Red Sox hat out in a minute if you don't look out.
Yeah, well, this is a military company that does augmented reality. They're called Red 6, and they basically put a virtual fighter jet or a virtual enemy or a virtual fueling plane in the air. So as you physically fly your plane around, you can engage with an enemy in a real setting without tearing up two planes and having the risks. That's them. So Red 6, really cool company. What I wanted to ask
you something, which is, we are both working in Washington. We have a very similar view of what works and what doesn't work, but something right now isn't working well. And I tend to put more weight perhaps on the media, because that's the connective tissue between what goes on here and what people out there are able to see. And one of the things is, I don't find almost anybody in the mainstream media who's prepared to sit up and say, we got a problem. And you guys who are not in the media, you're not part of the priesthood, don't you dare be the critics, because remember the First Amendment, you're trying to shut us down. I'd like to see somebody out there, some respected institution, who will say, wait a second, we got a problem. And we got to find a way to rebuild a sense of trust in what we do. We got to weed out the bad guys. Maybe we got to find some other economic model that works. I don't know what the answer is.
Could one of the improvements be that we no longer do debates the way we do them? It seems ridiculous to have President
That is over. That way of having presidential debates, that is over.
If you are the biographer of,
I hope you're right. You think that's over?
Well,
I wish.
One of the main problems is the commission itself, and that we know, Pete, Robert, and I know the people who run that commission, and they're living in the past, and that's got to be completely changed. That's a non-starter for another presidential campaign.
Well, I hope.
When was the last time we had two candidates that we were all excited about? Like either side, where you're like, not my guy, but man, I think they could do a great job. Has that happened anytime in recent history?
What is that? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Two quality candidates where it didn't matter who won. He may not be your party person, but when you're like, man, either one of these such great choices. We're not getting. I don't feel like we're getting like Joe Biden. Let's just be honest. Probably not the shining light in the Democratic Party in terms of leadership, right? I mean, I'm pretty critical of the guy. Donald Trump, clearly not the shining light from the Republicans. why can't we incentivize? First off, we got to be nicer to the guy. We treat the president so horribly. But has there been a time in recent history where two candidates were up there and you thought, doesn't matter who wins, we're going to be in great shape after 4 years?
Well, before getting on to that, I want to say a word about debates. I helped create the Commission on National Debates, presidential debates, way back
Wow.
in the 1980s, and they're kind of ashamed of it. But this is the President of the United States, except when he's in a rare press conference, never has to debate, as opposed to a British Prime Minister who has to debate every Tuesday afternoon in front of Parliament, in which the opposition try to make him look like a jerk. So being able to stand up there and debate, I mean, that's a meaningless quality. It's not a good way of trying to figure out who really knows something, or who's going to be able to lead, or who really says something or other is going to follow through, or she is going to follow through on policies. I get drawn into it as well, but I have to remind myself, this is a fake. This is not the way I want to choose a president. I could have picked, I happen to going to support Joe Biden, he's going to be president, but I could think of 3 or 4 other people who ran who I think would do a better job for the country. Now, I just ruled myself out of the job in the Biden administration, but I don't want one anyway. But Pete, you're absolutely right. How do we get better people into the finals, into the World Series, rather than getting people from AAA ball who make it?
I think it goes back to the media, Robert. I think that what you were saying about questions every Tuesday afternoon in the House of Commons, Pete, if you've ever, and Robert and I both sat in the House of Commons in these sessions, you would never, ever, I don't care who the president of the United States is, that I would give them about 3 minutes. And they would sit down. Really, it is unbelievable, because you have to be.
That's a long time.
Think of it this way. You're going to be asked by a constituent, well, how do you feel about Brexit? And the next question is going to be, I have a woman in my constituency who can't get her toilet fixed. I've seen this. You have to be, you're the prime minister. You have to know everything from fixing a toilet in public housing to negotiating with the EU. Now, I'm an American president. I'm sorry. They wouldn't even begin, because, we have a different system. I mean, they're responsible for their constituents as well as being the leader of the party and of the government. We don't have the same kind of system, but still, Robert's point is very good. And I think of it all the time. Put an American president up in the way Margaret Thatcher or any of these other people had to respond. Oh, no way. You couldn't even begin to have someone. Now, to really when you really look at the presidents we've had, the category of great is not filled with a lot of these people. For some reason, we get people to serve, or people serving our country, that are, why are they there? We have partisan politics. So we get people who are either rise to the head of their party. They don't necessarily rise to national recognition. They rise in partisan politics. You have media favorites that do this or do that. A lot of it is based on your ability to communicate in terms of campaigning, because really a president goes into office for 4 or 8 years, and what are they doing the whole time? They're campaigning.
Well, also to realize, as you know, James, the president's only one person who heads an administration. Now, the Trump people called it deep state, partly because they wanted to run it from the top and get everybody out. But there is not just bureaucracy, but people representing interests across what the nation cares about. You got members of Congress who have to vote on all kinds of stuff. And I think part of the way we elect members of Congress is a good part of the problem. We've had a breakdown in bipartisanship, in part because of the role of money in politics. You know as well as I do that the most important cost of a campaign at virtually any level, certainly federal campaign, is to buy media time. It is not to put together spots. It's to buy media time from the mom and pop stations. Stations are given a license to broadcast. They don't pay anything for it, or minuscule, and then they are able to put out their messages, and politicians have to pay them in order to get their message across. We don't have free television time. We've experimented with it for a while, and then we got rid of it. Some other countries say there has to be a certain amount of free television time given to the two parties. Now we then get around, oh, well, what about third parties and all that? Because the media doesn't want that. The media really do want to keep control over what people get to see. And that's the institution, in my judgment, of the four branches of government. It's the fourth branch that most needs to reform itself. And I don't know how to do that.
I think that this is a critical issue that really needs to be discussed now when we're not in a presidential campaign, because very often people will say, maybe they'll ask me, well, you have these political opinions, excuse me, about leadership. Why don't you run for office? I'm like, oh, I run out of the room as fast as I can. Because, and it's not that I would never win, and they don't really want me, but they ask that question. Well, what would you run for elected politics? Well, no, I don't want my grandchildren thrown out of their classes at school. I don't want, the cost that a person pays and a family pays for having a person even run for dog catcher, run for, there's so much contention, and there's so much personal attacking. Largely using social media, to go back to that for a second. But anyway, the main problem here is, are good people willing to put themselves in a potentially compromised position where the media is going to go immediately? I always say they're going to go back to the 6th grade where I was at Pierce Elementary School, and they're going to find that I kicked a guy in the butt, or, hit him on the shoulder or something like that. They're going to find that. And then that's going to come back and be an issue. So I think you have to be crazy to run for political office.
I agree with that. People I've advised who've run for president, I said, the first thing you got to understand is everything that ever happened in your life is going to come out. Everything. You can disguise anything. It's all going to come out. Because instead of saying, does Joe Blow over here, who is got all these kinds of defects, but by God, this person is going to give us a good health system or work for it, good educational system, do something about infrastructure, keep us safe abroad, the things that really matter. The story I really like is somebody went after the First Lady. She was at a tree planting in the Rose Garden, and she was wearing high heels. That was a Washington Post story, okay? To which I responded, I've got a picture sitting on my wall here, you can't see it, of a tree planting in the Rose Garden, 1964, Lyndon Johnson, Arbor Day, planting a tree. I took the picture. Standing next to him was the First Lady. She was wearing high heels.
And that's the story.
But that was no story back then. Who cared? But nowadays, if the president didn't put his hand on his heart and his wife had to nudge him to put his hand on his heart during the Star-Spangled Banner, that's front page. Come on, give me a break. I mean, as I say, I don't like Donald Trump, but the way he was savaged, even before he became president, I say, well, that's just working for Trump. He knows how the average American says, come on, give me a break. Give me a break.
Well, Trump was a gift. Trump was the biggest gift the media ever received.
Pardon?
Trump was the biggest gift the media ever received. They could spend hours and hours and hours skewering him because he had a lot to be skewered about, right? So he had so much fodder. But you know what I think today? If you're going to run for office, I think you should stand up and say, hey, I'm running for office, and I want you to know 50 things about me that you're not going to like. Just put it out there. Get rid of it and make it a non-story. But it's not going to satisfy their appetite. They're going to either fabricate something or they're going to make up something, because otherwise they'll be out of a job.
If the Monday morning after the Watergate break-in, and incidentally, I was in that office earlier in the evening, then I went out of town. Otherwise, I would have been there at 3 a.m. and it wouldn't have happened. But if Nixon on the Monday morning said, tell me what happened, and Monday afternoon he went on the media and said, here's what happened. This was wrong. It was a crime. I just fired these guys and they're going to go to the slammer. that would have been the end of Watergate. But every day it kind of fed the kind of thing. And it's true, you say about Trump, he knows what he's doing. He knows he can dominate the airways and that the average American is not going to pay attention to it. They just say, who cares? Who cares? And incidentally, one other thing, Bill Clinton cheating on his wife with all the women. Every man in the country, except you and me, and Pete, the three of us, would say, hey, who doesn't lie about sex?
I know.
Give me something real.
I know.
One of the things that strikes me about the modern day candidate is they all say, day one, as I'm president, I guess they forget that they're either senators or also not going to be king or queen, but they're always going to make these changes on day one. I would submit that given our political partisanship, Pete, as president, would say, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have every person from Congress in my office over the next 100 days. And we're going to work on how we work on things together. And don't send me a bill that isn't at least 60-40 bipartisan. I don't care what it's for. It better be bipartisan if you're going to send it to me, because we're going to get together. But I hear things
Cal, we're going to
totally
run
opposite.
for president. For example, the media want, and also in the debates, what are you going to do about health care and the various things? If I were president, running for president, and I wanted to be honest, I said, look, we know we've got to get more health care coverage for more people in this country. And I don't know how we're going to do it. Once I become president, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to hire good people. I'm going to sit down with the leadership of Congress. We're going to get people from all over the country who know what they're doing. And we're going to figure out a way to crack this nut. But to ask me what I'm going to do now, how could I possibly answer that until we start working the process and with the people who know what's going on? But instead, you got to come to how much is it going to cost? Are you going to do this? Are you going to do that? You can't possibly do that. Can't possibly do it.
Well, I think the reason you can't is because you've already promised certain things in your campaign, and the media is going to come back and hold you responsible for that. So if you look at Biden's cabinet selections and sub-cabinet positions, okay, he's already been criticized. He has the most diverse slate of people to fill these jobs that you've ever seen. That's fine. But he's already being criticized for not having enough this and not having enough that. And if you think that you can ever satisfy your constituents or your political base with, for example, diversity on the diversity issue, you'll never be able to satisfy them, because they're going to be people that they know how to work the media too. So it's not just politicians or voters or the media that's using people to manipulate or create a story for them. So it is people, and I'll give you a good example. So I had a lot of calls over the past, 3 or 4 weeks about this series called The Reagans. So I was alerted early on. Now, I spent 3 days of interviews with the producer of The Reagans. I was interviewed for 3 days in the St. Regis Hotel, downtown Washington, D.C. In fact, I brought them to my home so they could use some of my my personal collection of photographs. Oh, they were, we promise you, Mr. Rosebush, is going to be, well, media promise is not worth anything. But anyway, I kind of bought into that they were going to present a balanced approach. Well, then I read in the Wall Street Journal, don't any thinking person should not watch this series, which then I certainly did not. But what's the point of it? It's just like the series, The Crown, right now. It's a whole political whack job. It's a political whack job by a person who is a Republican. That means an anti-royalist. So what they want to do is they want to bring shame on the royal family, and they're doing it as if it isn't. It is their quality of production that's so high that's making people think that it's the truth. It is not the truth. It is not the truth about these people. And so you can look at it there, but it's the same thing happening here. How do you get an actual true picture of what these people were really like? Okay. How do you really get that? And how do you get, where is the integrity in reporting? Where's the truth in reporting? And we have to, I don't know. I think, to be honest with you, I think this is the biggest problem that our country faces.
I agree with that. The Crown, incidentally, is designed to try to promote generation skipping. They're trying to get rid of Charlie so they can get to Harry. That's
Yeah.
about. And I think it's one reason the Queen hangs on, it's another matter. Now, in terms of this diversity in the cabinet, I like what Biden is doing to try to show that he's got broader perspective. But quite frankly, that's meaningless in terms of policy. The real thing, if I were fighting a particular interest group, would be, how do I get the president to actually do things when he's president? How do I get President Biden to do these things? Whether I have my person as secretary of this or secretary of that, it didn't really matter when it gets down to that. It's how do you help the president put together a coalition so that my constituency interests will actually get something into legislation. And if you can buy off a constituency, I'm sorry, it's as cynical as that. Buy off a constituency by giving them a particular cabinet post, well, fine, but that doesn't do the job. A friend of mine actually said, and I won't use his name because he probably disowned me. He said, look, one reason Biden's doing it is so that later on, when he cannot satisfy those constituencies, because he just won't be able to get the stuff done, maybe he will, maybe he won't, he can then say, well, but I gave you the secretary of such and such. Don't criticize me for it. In other words, so the balance of who's in the cabinet really doesn't matter very much, with one exception. Domestic politics is about brokering interests. Foreign policy is about competence. Get the people who are the most competent to do the job, because the outside world doesn't care who's president. We only have one of the votes in foreign affairs. You need to have people know what they're doing. But domestically, it's about brokering interests. And that is what happens within administration to the Congress, and who's holding these particular jobs is secondary.
That's awesome. I love it. I always love when you bring up the Watergate thing too. Every time we talk, it just blows my mind. You're like, if I wouldn't have left.
Yeah. James' point. You were just saying the most serious challenge we have is with regard to the media.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
James was just saying he thought the most serious problem we have is with the media. Did I get you right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, certainly. I think that what the underlying issue is accurate, true information. I think that is what is one of the biggest challenges that we face. And how do we broadcast that? And, this is why I always say that I didn't really I had a problem with Trump using Twitter as much as he did. But in principle, what he was doing was what Reagan wanted. Reagan felt that if he could only get free and unfettered access to his audience, he could make them believe anything he wanted to communicate. Now, Reagan, as you may know, when he graduated from college, he was going to go to Yale Divinity School. So I always say that he was going to be a minister to hundreds, maybe thousands. He became an evangelist to millions because his voice reached around the globe. And he had an authoritative way, an authentic way of speaking. So you see that Reagan decided, and everywhere we went, if we went to Moscow, he spoke at Moscow University. We went to Beijing. We spoke to collectivist farmers. Anyway. But the point is that he created the Saturday radio address. This had been used before Jimmy Carter, by FDR, and so forth. But Reagan says, if I can only reach the audience with my voice, I can convince them of anything. So when people complain to me about Twitter, I'm like, well, yeah, I get it. I don't like the things. To me, it's unbecoming of a president of the United States. It really should be left to the press secretary. But people do want to hear directly from the voice. And that's what Reagan did. He wanted to reach people directly with his voice, because there isn't a way that, if you buy the time, I guess we did, right, Robert? We bought the Saturday, the airways, or, they have to provide you with some of that. But anyway, we had that time, and every Saturday, reliably, you could hear the president give his spiel. Now, then, eventually they had a rebuttal or something like that, which is fine. But that's what he believed. And that is what I think Trump thought, that if he could just reach people with his own voice, he could convince them of anything.
Okay, let me pick up on that. I think you're exactly right. Roosevelt used radio. Kennedy, the era of television. Obama got more stuff out on the social media than anybody else had before. And the guy who transformed it, precisely as you say, how do I leap over the the stuff that's in between, so people can hear from me? Trump has done it with tweets, with Twitter. I wished we'd had a different president who discovered that and used it, but that is a technique. You're actually hearing from him rather than somebody else, and other people haven't used it effectively to go back at him. But that's the new world. And if you're a president, I'm going to say, well, I'm going to stop for a second and say one thing. Hunter's rule on this, which I developed several. I've been in 8 presidential campaigns. I developed several cycles ago. You show me somebody running for president who is president who says, "I do not hate the media," and I'll show you a liar.
Yeah,
They all do, and they all have what Trump brilliantly found a way to leap over the people who are trying to be in charge rather than the government people.
I will say a little. This is a very important topic. I will say something about what Reagan taught us and what he insisted, though. Reagan was a conflict-averse person. He did not have the ability to fire anyone. And now I always say I've sat many evenings in front of the news with him, and unquestionably, every news broadcast would have a lie or an unfactual statement about him. And I would see him, he would get agitated, but he always said, don't even attempt to wrangle with the media at all. And remember one thing, and this is one of the golden rules that I learned: don't be a fount, be a well, not a fount. He always said, Jim, be a well, not a fount. So you have people in the White House, of course, that are intended leakers. Then you have people who leak because they want to protect their own image, and maybe they're doing bad stuff. And I could cite some names, people who are doing bad stuff, and they leak so that they get protected by the media. I think that's pretty evil in my book, but that's what they do. But you have people, but you have the president saying to me, be a well, not a fount. What does that mean? Don't get in front of the journalist and just spout out things, but answer their questions. And so Reagan he took a very, let's be friends, try to be friends with the media. You never can really be, because they don't, and if you're a conservative, it's especially difficult. But that's the way Reagan's personality had it. And I think that's why he came away with this term Teflon president, because you couldn't really unnerve. He walked through life in a way that was so, you've seen it, Pete. In my last book, before this book, True Reagan, I described this because people they try to figure Reagan out and they can't, because he wasn't forthcoming. He never opened himself up from the inside like Lyndon Johnson. You could find anything about him. It was all there, right? But Reagan kept it bolted up tight inside. But he didn't want conflict with the media. So you would find him, trying to be friends with the media. That was his approach. Now, Trump was the absolute opposite. He wants to combat the media because he thinks he's feeding red meat to his base. And to a large extent, that's true, because his base doesn't trust the media either. So he's just dishing out for 4 years red meat to his media. And after that book that I just spoke of came out, people said to me, "Oh, we want you to go and talk to Trump about the way to speak to the media." I said, "Oh no, that would be laughable, because I would never. I'm not man enough to tell Trump how he should change his disposition toward the media. That guy, and I'm probably wrong. Trump should do what he thinks is right. He wants to feed red meat to his media. Totally different than Reagan. I mean, they were saying to me, asking me to do that because they wanted Trump to be like Reagan, but that they're two vastly different people. So, you have to do what and I think Trump was probably right, as much as I cringe over every single tweet that he sends.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about Reagan and the way he did it. And he used to drive us Democrats nuts by his technique, because it was something we couldn't get our hands around. one of my other rules, which has now been broken by Trump, obviously, is never, never, ever take on the media because they control the airwaves and they'll take vengeance. I remember in the '84 campaign, I was involved. I was working for Mondale. And at one point, John Glenn, after a primary, criticized the way the media had covered him. And I instantly said, bye-bye, John Glenn.
Mm-hmm.
Sure enough, they jumped all over him to the end of him. Well, Trump is the first person in politics at the presidential level who said exactly what you did. I'm going to take him on head on, and I'm going to defeat him by appealing to a lot of people, and not just his base. There are a lot of other people out there who are maybe not Trump people who like the idea that somebody's taking on those folks, the bi-coastal elites who dominate the discourse. They like it that Trump is taking it on. And again, that drives us nuts. But he said he made a conscious decision or an unconscious decision. I'm going to break that rule. And once I've broken it, I'm just going to break it day after day after day. And it's worked for him fantastically. You don't get 75 million votes or whatever it was without that having worked for you.
He actually has over 100 million votes because there's probably more people voting against him than for Biden. Like, he got the vote out like no other candidate in history.
It's true.
I wanted to ask this because I've got.
I mean, we could have put Joe's blogs up instead of Joe Biden, and still would have made a run of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask because I've got your guys' fantastic experience in front of me about these accords that the Trump administration has managed to get through. You got UAE, Kosovo, and Serbia. I mean, that was out of left field. Those guys agree that they don't like each other but want to start working on doing business. I think that this is a remarkable defining achievement of his administration, but you guys are the pros. What do you think, Robert, about these? And then they somehow got smashed in the media. Maybe I'm wrong, but these seem like good things, having these Islamic Arab countries normalizing relations with Israel. Well,
on the Kosovo Serbia thing, that was done by diplomats. President probably didn't even know about it, but presidents come out and they take credit for stuff.
Sure.
The famous Oslo Accords between Israel and some others wasn't even done by the United States. It was done by a guy who was a friend of mine up in the foreign minister of Norway. And when he got it done, then the president of the United States, I think it was Clinton, said, well, I'm going to have the signing of the White House and I'm going to take credit for it. And the guy wasn't even allowed on the platform.
That's great.
Holst, who did the negotiating. Now, in regard to the Middle East, that's a whole separate program. I think it is good that more countries are recognizing Israel and dealing with them. But what's going on there is the common enemy in Iran. And I'm afraid that we're still in for a lot of trouble there, in part because Trump, begging your pardon, messed up one of the most important things that's been done in the Middle East ever, which was the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which stopped the Iranian nuclear program if it was going towards a military thing. It was the second most important achievement for Israel after the Israel-Egypt Treaty of 1979. Now, why Mr. Netanyahu is against it, I'm going to let him speak for himself. But by getting out of the JCPOA 2 years ago, I'm afraid Trump made things worse for us, worse for Israel, and in the long term hasn't helped very much for promoting peace. But if more countries are recognizing Israel, fine, that's great. That's great.
Well, I think it's certainly in global affairs. I think that's his biggest accomplishment, no question. And I think the reason that he could do it, when I think back to, I felt that it was the greatest failing of our administration that the president didn't focus more on the Israel issue, but he felt, and as I mentioned to you earlier, Pete, he had another law, and that was don't ever start a battle unless you know you've won it already. And he knew that he was not going to win in the Middle East, that there were too many forces.
I can just say that goes way back. But Reagan picked it up. That's okay. That's good.
Whose was it originally?
Lao Tzu, he was Chinese, you know.
Lao Tzu. Yeah, exactly. You're totally right. Absolutely right. Yes, it is from Lao Tzu. Yes. So, but this is something that Reagan, yeah, he did pick up, and thank you for clarifying that. So you see that Reagan, looking at the Middle East, everyone would say, "Oh, Mr. President, we don't touch it because there are forces, very strong forces that oppose Middle East peace. They don't want peace. They want to continue disruption because that's the only way that they can isolate or control Israel." So that is something that was troubling to Reagan, but he wanted to focus on his other big foreign policy initiative. And I felt that he was a strong enough persona to have been assert himself more successfully in the Middle East. He did not. I think it's a big failing. So anyway, here comes, I call it Jared. I call it Jared's success. It was all his flying around and meeting with the heads of these countries and basically selling them a business deal. That's what it is. It's a business deal. And I think it's, he's saying to them, hey, this is good for your economy to associate with Israel, to sign these kind of accords where you can do business together, where you can be talking to each other. I think having a good business deal can also be promotive of strong diplomatic relations, which can also build a consensus, more of a consensus in the Middle East to bring some kind of final solution there. So I see it as a building block in terms of where we're going in terms of peace and where we could go in terms of peace in the Middle East. But I see it on the way to it. I see it as a very productive way to build constructive channels of communication and trade. I think those are things that are often overlooked. And I think that would be typical, I think, of what Trump or the Trump family, the way they would do it. They're way out of their depth in foreign policy, but if they're out of their depth in foreign policy, they're over their depth in business. So they know they've already been doing business deals in the Middle East. So this is just another business deal, really. And I think it can work in behalf of, a stronger, allies, bringing in a stronger group of allies to support Israel. And I think that can be very good. I think it's signature success.
Well, we may disagree on that, but I will put it this way to try to be positive, because one always has to try to be positive. In this business of foreign affairs, you don't say, how did we get here? You say, okay, what do I do now? Because you're dealing with the facts. We've got to try to find a way to get back into that nuclear agreement one way or another in order to keep more nuclear weapons from coming into the area. We need to work on a security structure for the region. We can't just be based upon Israel having relations with more countries than it did before. We've got to find a way to deal with the Turks. We've got to find a way to deal with the Chinese and the Russians, who are now major engaged. Incidentally, the Russians got in partly because of miscues by Obama and partly miscues by Trump, but we now got them there. We are now in a situation with regard to Afghanistan in which the Taliban is going to win. It was always going to win, but it's a decent interval now, but if they're going to win. We need to have a team, and I hope Biden's got that team, that's going to sit down and figure out what are America's basic interest in the whole region. Incidentally, getting involved in Arab-Israeli is something you got to really have your head examined if you're going to do that. I've been working on that for 57 years now, and I still haven't gotten anywhere. And only you're not going to deal with the Israel-Palestine thing until a president says, if he wants to, I'm going to grab hold of this. I'm going to do whatever I have to do till it comes to the end. And no president since Jimmy Carter has been willing to run that risk. And look what was done to him. Look what was done to Jimmy Carter. And the rest of them, they've done a little bit here or there, but it doesn't get them anywhere. So I'm hoping that the team that Biden brings in is going to say, what's most important for the United States out there is to create some kind of security structure so American interests can get promoted. And let's take what Trump did, not the negative on the nuclear agreement with Iran, but the positive what was done with Israel and these other states. Let's build on it. Now, whether he's going to do that or not, I have no idea.
I think that was the greatest gift that Trump gave to Biden and Biden's administration in terms of foreign policy, building those alliances.
How about the energy independence? What's Biden going to do with that?
Out of the nuclear agreement with Iran, which is going to be incredibly difficult to move forward on the nuclear part of what we have to achieve.
Any thoughts on the energy independence that Trump achieved and what Biden's team will do with that? I mean, I see it as an opportunity to do things domestically and abroad.
Well, I certainly hope, and this is related to the Middle East, of course, but energy independence in the United States was a critical achievement. Not just, this has to do with China, our relationship with China and China's takeover of the rest of the world as well. But we have to sustain and support energy independence. It's one of the most urgent foreign policy initiatives that we can make, even though it's a domestic policy. So I think that's critically important. At the same time, I certainly agree that we should be focused on producing clean energy and pursuing alternatives to supplies of energy as rapidly as we can. And I'm sure that the inventiveness and the competitiveness of American business and enterprise is going to be able to come up with those answers.
Energy independence is a marvelous slogan. I'm glad we're doing it. Okay. I'll let people sort out the environmental problems. I got some views, but we don't have a whole show to do that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't make us independent of the Middle East, because all of our allies in Europe, plus Japan, are still totally dependent on that part of the world, and we can't walk away from them. So let's not congratulate ourselves about that we've solved this problem. You just introduced something else, which I don't want to be a naysayer, because I believe in being positive. Climate change is the only issue that really matters for the world. And even the Paris Accords are just a tip of the iceberg of what has to be done. Clean energy in the United States, even if we did it all, isn't going to get us there. And think of all the other countries that are going to have to do things. And we're going to run out of time pretty quickly. And the changes that are going to be required in American society, other society, and international relations, there's nothing in human history to match that. But that's for another show, and it's going to be after change in my lifetime. Worried about grandchildren are going to have to face this.
Yeah. And hopefully that we can use some of this money not going to the Middle East and war conflicts to hopefully work on investing in companies that want to do, greener tech and everything else, and continue, as we already are, on reducing our consumption of coal. I mean, there is progress being made, but holy cow, China's got a giant middle class, bigger than all of the United States. And so how do we balance that? We had Bjorn Lomborg on the show, and he was talking, he's got some Nobel level economists, and they're like, the bigger dollar spend that makes more sense is to just get people out of poverty so they can also reform their lives, make them energy efficient so that they don't have to burn cardboard and wood inside their house. And like there's all these things. It's such a big problem. You're right, Robert. Like we need to continue to get after it and continue. We have to partner with other countries in a way that we never have before if we're going to actually tackle this thing.
If we're allowed to get into substance rather than process, we've talked most about process. If you don't get the process right, you never get to the substance.
Right.
I hope that President Biden will not do too much foreign policy. There's some things he has to do, okay? For example, the New START treaty, which limits nuclear weapons, expires on February the 5th, unless they find a way of extending it. I mean, that gives him, 2 weeks to get that done. I'd like Biden to be a domestic president. We've got health, we've got the education, we've got the infrastructure. If we're going to deal with China, we got to get more jobs, we got to make more stuff at home. If I go to a Walmart or any of these other places, I want to buy something that's all made in China. We got to find a way to really invigorate the American way of life. And can I use the phrase, make America great again?
Robert.
That's a great phrase. Bring it home. Let's, we got to get that done. And the foreign policy, which is basically my bread and butter, I think is of secondary concern now, except in certain areas we really have to deal with. We got to be able to compete in the future. And that means the greatest investments need to be at home. We've spent $3 to $4 trillion in the Middle East. I wish we would have found a way to spend that money here. And I hope going forward, we find a way to spend most of that money here.
James?
Oh, I thought we were at the end of our time here.
I was just going to let you have a final word.
Oh, well, I certainly don't disagree with anything that Robert has said. One exception, I would say, to Biden's attentiveness to domestic policy versus foreign policy is China. Because if you take your eye off that ball for 1 second, they're going to move even faster. I mean, we know their plan is published. We know what their timeline is. We know what their plan is. We know where they're going. We know what their objectives are. And we must be 100% focused on disrupting their plan. If we're not serving our own people in the best way, and we won't even have a domestic policy to argue about if we don't stop the Chinese encroachment and control of the rest of the world. It's fortunate for us, even though the way they operate it is deviously. It's a published plan. It's the plan of the Chinese Communist Party. So we know that, and we know where it's going. Why wouldn't we be unfaithful to our own voters, our own citizens, if we just for a second took an eye off of China? So I would say that's a big exception to being just focused on domestic policy, because I would call that domestic policy too. It's really protecting our interests.
Let me add a word to that. I've tried not to be negative on Trump in terms of substance, but getting out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a big mistake, and that created a vacuum which China's trying to fill. Every single country out there, except maybe North Korea, would rather be with us than with China. We got to start working and building those up again. And when I talk about the focus on domestic, obviously China and foreign policy is the number one issue, but we got to get our economy straight so we can compete against the Chinese and stop having to buy so much from China. We also need to do things, which I think there's now a consensus, to try to stop the stealing of American technology, to stop the extortion against American companies that want to deal with. We've got to make sure that Chinese students and others who come here are not just agents of the Chinese government, but at the same time, let's try to prevent from having another Cold War if we can possibly do it, provided the Chinese are willing to go along with that. Because once you get yourself into a rigid Cold War, you lose all kinds of flexibility. And we need to be flexible in what we can do.
Well, I think there's a lot that we can do to preempt a Cold War. And you mentioned a handful of them also. These Confucian cells on university campuses, this has got to be stopped. So there's stuff that's been done in plain sight that we can handle and we can take care of it if we have the resolve to do it. But more people have to be educated about this threat. This is not something that should just be known by the few or the people who read this stuff or the people who are engaged in foreign policy and domestic policy. These are things that everyone has to be. And I think there's a general, now you see in Congress, there's more of a resolve. Among our allies, there's more of a resolve. And I think we have to bring our allies in on this as well. And I think exposure is probably one of the first and most important tools that you can use by exposing what the Chinese are trying to do, especially in their Belt and Road strategy, where they have gone in and invested in infrastructure in these countries, and then they've left failing infrastructure, or they've let these countries in such debt which is their design, so that they're beholden to them, that these countries are suffering from. This is a perfect time to go in through diplomacy and economic aid, to go in and say, look, this is the way they've left this, work with us. And I think this has to be a full out campaign to really alarm, threat, to educate the rest of the world about this and get everyone really gathered together on this, because it's something that, of course, will impact us. But one other thing I want to say, I believe completely that we have to bring industrial production back to the U.S., and we need to immediately block, to the extent we can, the extortion of our technology and all the things that China has built their economy on the backs of Americans, no question. I mean, we've allowed it, and that has to immediately stop. But I think Trump in addition to what we were talking about in the Middle East, to me, his signature accomplishment was what he did for the American worker, because we saw the lowest unemployment rates among Hispanics. Black household income rose higher than it had been before. All of these things, I think we were really, we had the lowest unemployment rate. We were really moving in this right direction until we were crippled by this pandemic. So I think a lot of that was going, and you could attribute it to whoever you want, but I think we were going in the right direction, and I think we were more enlightened about China. And I think it has to be a two-pronged effort. I think it has to be a wide-eyed recognition of what the Chinese are trying to do, and to fight that with all of our might at the same time, while we're fueling American ingenuity, creativity, solutions to what the world needs, and provide it. And America has the ability to do that.
Well, I believe that if we could have, it's too late now, take about $3 trillion of what we put into the Middle East and Afghanistan, we could have done a lot of what you said with regard to a lot of these countries against the Belt and Road Initiative. If we stayed in the Trans-Pacific Partnership instead of getting out of it, that would have helped us out. But one of the things I believe we have to focus in, not just exposing what the Chinese do, but is to get the tools, and some of them might be military, but a lot of them are the economic tools at home. We need to start finding some technique to shame is a quality that I'm afraid most people in many sectors don't care about, but to get American companies to understand you're American companies, rather than pushing jobs abroad, to start finding ways to push the jobs, bring the jobs back to America. Trump did some of that. I hope Biden does a lot of that. Because unless we have coherence and cooperation across the economy, across the nation, in order to deal with, let's say, the Chinese thing, which is number one, we're not going to get anywhere. And it's got to be coherent, and it's got to have the kind of leadership across the board, rather than just saying, oh, China's going to be stealing our laundry and all that kind of stuff. No, we got to be smart about it. Got to be smart about it.
Well, it's a tricky issue because we have a free market economy, and you have companies who are using slave labor in China to produce their products. And that is unacceptable. While on one hand, they're putting millions of dollars into political campaigns to make their own products and their own company look stellar, and then maybe they do have great products. But I don't think that saying one thing out of one side of your mouth and doing the other, which is bad practices, labor practices in China, that it's viable. To me, it is not viable. And I think that's where the exposure of this information needs to be made clear, so that the consumer can respond in however way they want. The trouble is, of course, that these companies make products that consumers want. So it's complicated. It's complicated, but I think it's the job.
I have one here. It's my iPhone.
Yeah, me too. So it's the job of the president, though, to really have the courage to expose these. And maybe you might say, since Biden is going to be a one-term president, that I don't think he will take it this way, but he does have the opportunity to spend more political capital. He can be more outspoken. He can be more of a leader. I don't think he's going to be, but nothing against him in particular. But I think that this is a time when I've often dreamt about, a 1-6-year term for a U.S. president instead of 2 terms, because you're always running for the next. Commonwealth of Virginia has that, for better or worse. But I think this is a time where he could, or someone could use 4 years of a term in the White House to really stand up and do some politically costly things.
Okay, I agree with all of that. But that gets us back to the question of how do we get politicians? Now it's going to be Congress for 2 years. The presidential campaign is not going to begin until January 21 next year, for 4 years from now. That's what happens. So that we can get members of Congress to focus not just on having to raise money for the next campaign, but on the kinds of things we have to do as a society to be able to compete abroad and to get the things done, whether certainly with regard to China, but other things, we've got to have coherence and we have to have a national commitment, which a president can start, but he's got to have an awful lot of cooperation, including in the private sector, which is run amok. A lot of these companies operating abroad without realizing that they are undercutting the future of America if everything is made abroad. You pulled out, God, I don't even know where my BlackBerry is. I use a BlackBerry that's got a hard keyboard. We can make those chips in America.
Yeah, we can.
Or they can be made in Taiwan or even in Vietnam. It doesn't have to be made in China. And if we are able to create incentive structures for the American industry, American companies, to bring that stuff back to the United States, the ingenuity is here. One of the things about the Chinese is that they don't have the same quality of human inventiveness that we have.
Right.
We have economic and technological, but not human inventiveness. People don't want to live in China, don't want to live on a Chinese system. They'd rather live on a Western democratic system. That's a tremendous asset. Incidentally, you pointed out something about Chinese students in American universities. The Chinese were smart about that. They sent their students here. The Soviet Union was stupid. They kept their people from coming to American universities. I'm not arguing against keeping anybody out, but let's start being clever about these things and starting to have a coherent view, but one that does not lock us into a confrontation over time in which defense budgets are going to go up and we're going to forget about doing the things that are going to make us competitive for the long term as the greatest competitive engine that was ever created.
I love this conversation, fellas. I don't want to keep you any longer, but we'll have to do another one because I didn't even get to talk at all.
You didn't get to talk at all.
But I love it. I love these kind of shows, and I love what we're saying. Like, we have to balance China's ability to service its middle class and not, explode into conflict while still, not letting them explode all over the world, and to get their hands off of our products. And oh my gosh, there's so much. I don't know if you guys know this, but we open 2 counterintelligence investigations against China a day, and then we still have a few hours left over. I mean, on average. So yeah, it's definitely interesting to talk about. And then as soon as you get the policy sorted out, this is the reason why I know Bob is because the policy is great, but what happens on the ground, and how do we get this thing to work? Because we can go somewhere and say, hey, China built you a crappy road. Farmer's going to point at me and go, what about that crappy school you guys built? I'm going to be like, I don't know. It's hard to get these things right when we get down at the ground level. Either way, thank you guys so much. It's a fantastic
chat. One other thing about China.
Please.
They have an aging population, which is going to pose challenges for them that are going to be immense.
Yeah, you're right about that.
Why do we always say the people who are challenging out there are 10 feet tall and we're about 2 feet tall? We're 10 feet tall. We're 12 feet tall. Yeah. If we're smart about it, the others are not going to be able to do in the kind of world, in the kind of life we want to live, a democratic, small d world. Incidentally, it's interesting that James and I tended to, I think, to have agreed about 90% of everything that came up here, because we, with 95% of people who ever work for the government, believe in the country and working together. We may not always decide on what we want to do, but we all agree we want to make this country still a better place.
Amen.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I identify myself as center right, middle left, right? And ask me on a given day, but what I always want is I believe in us, all of us here in America, and the people that want to come here. My favorite American's the next one, because they're desperate to come here and do what they're dreaming of, and not many countries have that kind of magnet. And so ultimately, we will be all right, but we do have to keep on the task. Fellas, thank you so much. Let me sign off here. Hold on one sec.